I think transmaterial worlding is a practice of hope. In a very honest way, it's recognizing that the world is in a terrible state. We can't thingify things. We can't separate ourselves out from the world. But at the same time, we have to take on board that we have responsibilities and choices. And from a social constructionist point of view in particular, we have to think, who's involved in this conversation?
This is Positivity Strategist, and I'm the host, Robin Stratton-Burkessel. This season 5 is an exciting collaboration with the Taos Institute. Our inquiry for the season is Constructionist Practices as Social Innovation. Our special guests are Taos Institute associates who've contributed chapters to the SAGE Handbook of Social Constructionist Practice. This episode is a conversation with 2 women who've co-authored a chapter in the handbook, Dr. Gail Simon and Dr. Leah Salter. Gail, you're English, an academic leading a professional doctorate program in systemic practitioner research at the University of Bedfordshire in the UK, and you're editor of the online dialectic journal Murmurations. And you do other very important professional work and fun things in your spare time, like watching box sets with your partner, going for long walks, and making fires on very cold nights. So my first question to you, Gail, is what box sets can you recommend?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, I think generally I have enjoyed the Scandinavian noir box sets. They're very engaging, but you have to be able to get beyond the first episode, which always shows the quite grim, graphic, gory details. And I'm not very good at being frightened. I'm really terrible at anything scary. So once I get beyond that, then I'm into the drama, the mystery, the characters, the scenery, and I'm carried away with all of that.
Yes, I have to say I've been watching 2 Norwegian shows, which are amazing, and don't ask me to say what their names are.
Well, another one I like, actually, you said Norwegian, is Dag, D-A-G. And I don't know if it's on anywhere at the moment, but it's about a really badly behaved relationship therapist. That appeals to me enormously. It's very funny and very moving.
Oh, right. Do you watch it in Norwegian or do you have subtitles? And subtitles?
Jeg snakker litt norsk, but I don't really speak Norwegian, so I watch with subtitles.
Okay, yeah, I like it too. Okay. And so, Leah, I want to welcome you as well. You're Welsh, living in South Wales, and I understand that you're working with the National Health Service, the NHS in Wales. You're also supervising doctoral students, and you continue your therapy practice. You write for publications, including Murmurations, and your research interests include systemic practice-based research, women's well-being, parental mental health, working with groups and communities, narrative inquiry, and more. So my question to you is, do you have any spare time?
That's a good question too. I'm slightly taken aback by Gail's Norwegian, so I'm on the back foot. It's interesting how, you think you know someone and then you learn something new. So I had no idea that Gail had this skill. But yeah, so I do have some spare time, and my spare time is usually taken up with walking along the coast. That's probably my favourite activity. I live right on the coast, and my partner's a surfer, and we have a camper van, and we spend a lot of time enjoying the Welsh coastline, the British coastline, and when we can, further afield as well.
Beautiful, yeah. Well, I have that in common with you too. I absolutely love the outdoors, and the coastlines are very appealing to me.
Yeah.
So, Doctors Leah and Gail, in your chapter, you offer us that transmaterial worlding evokes ecological and contextual curiosity and invites questions that pay attention to relational affect involving a more than human relating and a more than local focus. So I would love to jump straight in, and I think it would be very lovely and most helpful if you talk to each other about this transmaterial worlding. Like, how do you begin to explain this way of being and doing in the world? I don't know if I have the language that I'm describing it well. And so a way of being and doing, and maybe it's, for those who are hearing the term for the first time, both if you could unpack transmaterial and then worlding, and then the combination of the two.
Yeah, it might be worth starting in a slightly different place, because you've probably heard, I guess lots of people have heard, that this era we're now living in is called the Anthropocene, was being named as such. That paleontologists are saying we can fairly safely say that human beings have tipped the balance in our shaping of the world. We're not just living in it, on it. We've actually shaped it, and we've quite possibly, a lot of people say this is a certainty, we're on the course to destroy the planet we're living on. Such is the power of being human. And one of the things that has been preoccupying not just Leah and me, but lots of people, both in academia and in the wider world. I mean, school children are perfectly knowledgeable in understanding that humans can't deceive themselves into thinking they can control their environment, that we can't see ourselves as top of some intellectual pile of beings in the world, of creatures, whether it's white male, heterosexual, strong, blonde, cool, all these kind of stereotypes of what apparently has most currency, most status, that we can't see one group of people as superior to another over gender identity, over color, over race and ethnicity, over religion and so on. But more than that, that we need to have more respect for not only other creatures that are not human creatures, but that we need to see other parts of our planet as alive. And not only that, but as entitled to have a say. So transmaterial worlding is an invitation to think, who should we be inviting to the table to have a voice and say what they know? And for the rest of us to find ways of listening with an open heart, an open mind, really, really listening respectfully, and being prepared to allow ourselves to be changed by what comes back at us.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I'm sort of slightly preoccupied because I'm sat here with my cat who's just come back from the vets from having a little operation, and she's really cross with me, and she can't decide whether she's more cross with me or more kind of unsettled with herself, and she's really unhappy. And and it would be very easy for me to kind of ignore that context, or just be in this moment and if you like, to give precedent to the human interaction that we're engaged with right now. But I'm also mindful of the non-human kind of context of our conversation, and also the setting up of the technology, that's part of this conversation. So the whole kind of, the whole context is at least partially in view, and at least, for part of the time. But of course, we move between those different perspectives, those different viewpoints. And so there might be times where I'm more preoccupied with my cat, where I'm more preoccupied with whether my computer is working okay, or whether I'm more engaged in this human-to-human interaction that we're not just with ourselves, but with other people who are listening with us. But the point is, all of these things are part of our ecology, and not just a part of. A part of suggests that we're all living separately from each other and from ecology, but we are making of ecology.
Yeah, and so it's this notion of we are co-inhabitors of this world. And so may I move to the term worlding?
Yes.
Now, I understand this term worlding we owe to Karen Barrett, who in 2007 wrote the book Meeting the Universe Halfway, Quantum Physics and the Entanglement of Matter and Meaning. So please speak to the worlding piece of transmaterial worlding.
I think transmaterial is easier for people to understand because everybody understands that humans do try and put themselves at the top of the control pile, and that we're starting to realize that maybe we should have been listening to either what other people have been telling us is going wrong, and we've ignored their voices. When I say we, I really am grouping everybody together, and not everybody would say that they've been ignoring those voices. But the worlding side of things, it's a development on from social construction, transmaterial worlding. Firstly, social construction, when it first came on the scene, as it were, through a number of people, but certainly names familiar in the Taos Institute would be Sheila McNamee, Harleen Anderson, and Harold Gulishian's absolutely stunning pivotal paper, Human Systems as Linguistic Systems. I think that was 1988. If anybody hasn't read it, you must read it. Why just look at quotes from that paper? Read the whole thing. It was really the most important paper of its era in terms of helping family therapists understand how they could rethink problems in families or in systems generally between people. And what transmaterial worlding is trying to do, I'll stay with social construction because that's important. The contribution of social construction, there are many contributions, but the primary ones have been to help people understand that we are making our worlds with each other through the language we're using. That how we say things, the words we use, the context in which we feel we can or can't speak, which voices are heard, which voices aren't heard. Social construction enabled us to foreground power relations and see that some voices get to describe things and to pin them down into certain understandings, which might not be shared. So some groups of people, some cultures might have dominated what gets described, what gets attributed certain characteristics, what's seen as important, and what isn't, and who isn't, and which texts get backgrounded or not just lost is often too innocent a term, destroyed, erased. Same with peoples, of course, and many countries around the world where entire peoples have been erased. So what we've tried to do with social construction is say, actually, we do more than live in language. We actually live in language and through language, but also in a material world. We live in a world of fabric of many living creatures and living entities. We live in a material world where there are power relations, not only between humans, but between humans and other parts of the planet, other things that grow, that have changed, have knowledge, other peoples that have had knowledge that may or may not be allowed into the table. So we've reframed social not just to include humans, but we've extended it to include non-human creatures, animals, life, flora and fauna, but also to think about things that are often considered dead, inanimate. And we've challenged that. In our paper, we've written about how, and built on the work of people like Jane Bennett and Chen, and we've said, you can't really consider something like a rock as dead material, when actually it's taken millions of years to become the form it is, and is in the process still of changing, perhaps in a different time frame. That doesn't mean it's not alive in some ways and giving life and part of life and part of what we build our lives on. So the the worlding process is how we make meaning, and more than that, how we're constantly being changed by trying to understand, by trying to formulate words and wisdom and knowledge, that we're always in the process of something like learning, becoming, learning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was thinking kind of story and becoming and story, and similarly, and thinking, the paper that Gail mentioned there, human systems as linguistic systems, and I guess part of what we're doing with this chapter is kind of extending the idea of linguistics. Extending what we mean by communication, and extending what we mean by who or what has a story to tell. Mm-hmm. And the who, or what is a really kind of crucial part of that. And I was thinking, the example that we use in the chapter around Uluru, in Australia. I was talking with a group of students, a group of doctoral students just this week, about their experience of reading the chapter. And one of the women was saying to me that she, the example of Uluru, she just found chilling. And that word really struck me.
Uluru, formerly known as Ayers Rock, that kind of classic iconic image that tourists would aim to visit if they were travelling through the Australian outback, has had, is it some kind of preservation order put on it? And the land around it, the rock itself and the land around it, recognised as a sacred space of a particular Aboriginal group. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of that group of people. But that it's no longer simply a tourist attraction where people can go and climb it. And I think one of the things you're referring to, that kind of last-minute rush of climbers who, frankly, couldn't have given the toss about the fact it was a holy space. Their pilgrimage, and that's maybe a far too generous a term, was to quickly go and climb it before the gates were put up and people said you can't climb it anymore. And is that what people were finding shocking? Yeah, sure. Yeah. And the example of Uluru, with that example, people were experiencing as chilling, but like an alarm call, a wake-up call. And the response, the feedback that I was getting from people, reminded me of how many young people at the moment, but the person who springs to mind is Greta Thunberg, who is kind of saying that she wants people to be alarmed. And I think there's been a lot of debate around whether it's unhealthy for young people to be exposed to these kinds of arguments, and whether young people are equipped to deal with the information that's being presented to them, and whether we're creating something that's now been coined as eco-anxiety. Whereas I think a lot of young people, the message that they are given is, yes, I am alarmed, but I choose to be alarmed. I take my alarm seriously, and I take my responsibility to my alarm seriously. And actually what I want you to do as an adult is not protect me from the alarm, but for you to take the alarm seriously. Don't just try and protect me from this. Don't diagnose me and treat me and create a whole diagnostic criteria around what's going on, but let's do something about this. We're at a very worrying tipping point in public health discourses where there is a lot of attention being given to something called eco-anxiety, as though it's some kind of individualized health problem. And I read in the papers yesterday about a 9-year-old girl who is striking on Fridays outside her school. Apparently nobody else wants to join in, or their parents won't let them. The paper reported how several children are doing this on their own outside school because, for whatever reason, the pupils are not joining in. In many places they are, in numbers. But they've started some kind of, I don't know if it's an online group or other point of connection, where people who are striking on their own can connect with each other and not feel isolated and be able to sustain each other across distance. And we're at a tipping point in terms of the adult-run mental health services and social services starting to reinforce and undermine a children's movement, actually a worldwide movement, in which people are saying, I am anxious, and there's a good reason for it.
Yeah.
I'm not illogical. I don't have a phobia. There are grounds for my discomfort, and I invite you to feel unsettled too. This is a great intervention by young people.
Absolutely. It's being an activist very early on. And it's almost, it illustrates for me that we can't throw our arms up in the air and roll our eyes and say, I don't know what to do. Or, people are actually taking action. So, you talk about the practical and the ethical options that when we look at transmaterial worlding as an inquiry, that opens up for us, right?
It's this worldview that the Taos Institute seeks to bring into practice through the lens of social construction. Here is Dawn Dole, the Executive Director.
We all search for ways to live a meaningful life. At the Taos Institute, we believe meaning can be found through sharing personal histories with others. Social constructionist practices support this form of discovery. Visit taosinstitute.net to find out more.
Returning now to my conversation with Gail and Leah, and it's such a wonderful example how we need new words, new language to be able to deal with some of the issues that we have today that we didn't have before. And transmaterial worlding is just one example.
So I'm wondering if this would work right now, that you could illustrate transmaterial worlding as a form of inquiry when it comes to what we're talking about now, what's happening on planet Earth in relationship to climate, glaciers melting, floods occurring, highest temperatures on record being recorded, droughts. And you talked about Uluru in Australia, and I have a situation, that's been occurring in Australia. It's very close to my heart, and that's a massive Australian bushfires.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, how might you, through this perspective, through this lens, social construction and the transmaterial worlding reframe of it or addition to it, complement to it, how might you engage in that kind of inquiry, like a case for research or inquiry? What could happen if you did that? How would you do that? If you had a student who said, I really want to go in and do some research on this and how we might kind of come up with some solutions, if that's possible, how might you begin that kind of inquiry?
I think one of the important things in thinking about researcher positions and the ethics of researcher positions is that researchers need to be often coming from inside of a locality. They need to be members of a community and not parachuted in some kind of academic expert who's interested in this situation. Mm-hmm. Those academics who are parachuted in actually can be quite useful as what Vicky Reynolds calls fluid and imperfect allies. It's a great expression, fluid and imperfect allies. And we can all be that. We can all be a fluid and imperfect ally in different situations. We probably are on a daily or weekly basis. But in a situation like this, this terrible, terrible tragedy that continues to unfold with the American bushfires, you would want to think what knowledges are around and who holds those knowledges. And
by Australian bushfires, we're talking about. They happened in California too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the burning of the Amazon forest as well.
Absolutely,
and the rainforest, which is happening under different circumstances, but in a sense, all man-made. But the question, who and what should we be involving in this inquiry is an important question. Who is doing the inviting? And if I'm invited to do some inquiry into not only how the bushfires wherever or the forest fires started and how they continue, how would I know who to invite? So we need to find out from a number of different people, and we need to do different kinds of listening. When I was running a workshop the other week on transmaterial worlding, we invited people to enact different parts of the forest, from the canopy to the tree, to the forest floor, to the roots of the trees, to the wind passing through, to the smoke passing through, to the smoke catching some of the dry leaves or turning things dry, and so on, to the river that had been altered by in its course by various other human interferences. So when people were doing these, what Harleen Anderson would have called an as-if exercise, doing these as-if exercises, speaking in the first person as if they are different parts of a forest, they have develop different awareness. They develop different consciousness and a heightened sense of responsibility for that environment. Furthermore, we also need to go further than as-if exercises, because humans do have a limit to their imagination. We can't always imagine what we don't know. We don't actually know what it's like to be a tree or a leaf. We can only imagine it. There are other people to think about and other knowledges. Maybe we need to look at paintings of forests. Maybe we need to look at old photos. Maybe we need to read other manuscripts. Maybe we need to talk with people who are now living, have been relocated, taken out of what was their family's historical heritage and environment, and relocated into camps somewhere or other places, and to listen to what stories and narratives they have to tell that contain all kinds of rich knowledge about how forests work, about how rain works, about how the seasons work. And we also need to be talking to current professionals and local members of the community. In a sense, most forms of activism are a form of research, and most forms of research need to be a form of activism. But we need to understand how people are protecting the planet, how people are helping others, whether as family therapists or as environmental activists. What is it that people are doing that's maybe a hidden knowledge, not necessarily measurable, not necessarily quantifiable in terms of tables and quantitative data, but that is very hidden, very complex relational activities that may be going out of sight.
Yeah, and out of sight, what are the stories from the culture that perhaps have been marginalized or discounted or lost? So, what else can we surface if we start to make this inquiry into thinking, well, who has something to contribute to this situation, to this story, and to potential futures? So, Leah, you, in your chapter, and the chapter is entitled Transmaterial Worlding as Inquiry, you offer some research questions. And so I wondered if you would talk to those questions.
Can I just add something to the previous conversation? The as-if exercise. So the as-if exercise is, becoming a tree or the roots of the tree, etc. And, when Gail was talking, I was thinking, so my first degree was in drama, or part of my degree was in drama, and I spent a lot of time being a tree. It's kind of like an everyday warm-up exercise to kind of be a tree for at least half an hour of your kind of drama class each day. But one of the most profound experiences I had many years later was in a body psychotherapy training session where I was invited to be an electricity pylon.
Ooh.
Now, this is a much harder task because you're entering something that we think of as or I would think of, and certainly at the time when I was doing this, I would have seen this as something that's kind of intrusive into my landscape, something that is kind of man-made and something quite ugly, something kind of unpalatable. often something that people don't want in their backyards. But it had the most profound effect, because I made myself, or I was, via invitation, really think about what that felt like. And that's part of what this chapter is about, is really kind of extending beyond our natural, maybe natural is not the right word, but our preconceived kind of comfort zones. Mm-hmm. So entering into a different kind of space. And I think that's where, Vicky Reynolds' ideas that Gail mentioned as kind of fluid and imperfect allies, where, that I absolutely don't consider myself a natural ally to an electricity pylon, but sometimes we have to kind of place ourselves in different kinds of positions in order to be most helpful. Now, I might have chosen to be an ally to something else or to someone else. But this is part of the kind of dilemma of research and of transmaterial research. And so the research questions are kind of inviting of that a step, I guess, outside of a comfort zone. So one of the examples that we use in the chapter is the example of Everest. So if a group of research, we've just talked about, as if exercise, thinking about researchers in the Australian context. But what we did through the chapter is think about, what if researchers were invited to engage with the question of, should climbers climb Everest? And if we were to do that from a transmaterial context, how might we extend the kinds of questions that might otherwise be asked? So the first question was, how could the snow at the bottom of Everest make its experience of being transformed by climbers heard in ways that climbers might be able to listen? Yeah, so it's a different kind of way of asking a question, of asking someone to put themselves in a different pair of shoes or take a different kind of perspective. I mean, that's just an example. But our experience of kind of sharing this chapter and another paper that Gail and I have written for Murmurations, which is a transmaterial world in beyond human systems. And our experience of sharing this chapter is that people can engage in those examples. So the research questions are perhaps broader and something that people can take into different contexts, sometimes kind of grounding it in a context that people may feel already a little familiar with. It can help people to kind of, I guess, to create some kind of picture of what we might be talking about.
So Michael White, a narrative therapist who many people will or be familiar with or can read up on, wrote borrowed from Foucault and Derrida, and wrote about voices also present, not yet heard. And what we're trying to think about is which voices feel they have most entitlement to speak, who's in charge of who gets invited to the party, which other voices are around that somehow we're not on the same radio frequency, so we can't hear what they're saying. So, for example, the dominant narrative around climbing Everest, and I don't know if any of your listeners will have seen those incredible photos of this dark line in the snow wiggling up to the summit of Everest, which is people standing still, not even moving, shuffling up to get to, I can't remember where it is. I want to say first base, but
base camp.
Yeah. And beyond that, people are queuing, not just queuing to get to Everest, but queuing all the way up Everest. And those pictures are alarming. Now, Everest is being slowly destroyed. It's going to have to at some point be protected in some ways. There are going to be some protected measures, but in the meantime, it's a big commercial enterprise. Its sacredness, the local knowledge, all of that has been sidelined, lost, seconded. It maybe something gets a paragraph in a travel leaflet about the history and the sacred attributions people have with the mountain, its local meaning. But by and large, people come from afar and pay a huge amount of money for the privilege of, I don't know if they get a certificate, but they get photographs, I guess, of them at the top clutching a flag. I have no idea. Them having climbed this mountain. Now, I do understand that people love to climb, and they love to climb, hard to climb mountains in some situations. But beyond a certain point, what's fascinating is people don't seem to be able to see the spirit of the mountain, to see the local communities, which, yes, of course, by now have become dependent to some degree anyway on the tourism economy of climbing. But lots of other things are being left out of the equation. Lots of other voices are not being heard. And there's a sort of an assumption that if tourism withdrew, then these poor people wouldn't know how to support themselves. They'd be devastated as communities. And we don't know that's the case. And nobody's really looking into that. There doesn't seem to be any kind of forward thinking or forward vision. It's sort of a metaphor for what's happening on the planet.
Sure.
We're both systemic psychotherapists. We're both trained systemically. And training systemically means that we think about people in context, that there are many contexts that we try and take into account when working with people, and place and history and materiality is really important. So we're always trying to understand what the influences are, what's getting in the way of people finding their own solutions to problems. And one of the difficulties with a lot of everyday systemic thinking, not specifically anything to do with systemic practice, is that people think it's to do with the individual or the individual family. There was a good example recently. There's been a lot of terrible child sexual exploitation in some cities. Parents were so upset and so angry that their children were allowed to carry on being sexually exploited by strangers outside of the family, because apparently a number of social workers continued to ask what was happening in the family that drove the children into the arms of dodgy, abusive strangers. Instead of understanding that maybe there was nothing wrong with what was happening in the family, that there was something about what people were doing with online contact, with technology, with offering other drug-related or practical resources that was attracting children, irrespective of what their family situation was. So we're not set up as a society to look at other kinds of systems. We think in terms of the local, the immediate, instead of maybe the slightly more remote, whether it's remote through technology or remote through more distant organizational or cultural, maybe people on the other side of the world. But we tend not to think sufficiently as a society about the connection between local and global. So one of the kind of interventions that could happen out of transmaterial worlding is inviting people to connect their personal desires, their personal understanding, their immediate situation with something that might be going on quite far away. So when we're starting to realize that when we buy a new mobile phone, we're continuing to keep children going into mines in really impossible conditions, in very abusive conditions. We might feel enriched by having a shiny new latest state-of-the-art thing, but we're keeping other families impoverished and at risk. Far away, we'll never know who they are.
Yeah.
And now the voice of Dawn Dole, the Executive Director of our partner and collaborator in this season of Positivity Strategist. It's highly likely that you're really interested in finding out more about what the TAS Institute offers.
The International Diploma in Social Construction and Professional Practice program invites students to embark on a project of personal and professional interest with individual mentoring and guidance from one of the faculty members. Visit tausinstitute.org www.net/diploma-program for all the information.
Yes, it's a wonderful institute with a fabulous community of associates, all of whom are guests on this season of Positivity Strategist.
At the beginning there, you gave us some sense of hope and aspiration of what's possible when we take on this lens, this way of being and doing in the world, which is really exciting. And I wondered, Leah, if you would also like to share what, some of the aspirations or some of the hopes that you have based on what you're learning, what you're contributing, how you're helping. What does this mean for you, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think for me, there's always hope that comes through connecting with other people. And it's a bit like my example of the tree or the pylon. It's kind of, it's more comfortable, it's easier to connect with people who have similar ideas or similar aspirations. So, working with Gail has been, a rich experience, and we've bounced off each other. And, a lot of the kind of process of writing together has been, trying to kind of keep one voice through the chapter, but the one voice has come from multiple and multi-layered conversations in person, over the phone, over Skype, over Zoom, over various different platforms. And there's something that is kind of generative and nourishing from making those connections. But I think in kind of putting these ideas out there, we're also inviting and I guess feeling optimistic about having conversations with people, whether that be in person or through people reading our work, so people where this feels very different, where this might not feel comfortable, where this might feel quite perturbing, or it might feel unsettling. And although that might be a less comfortable experience, that's also a hopeful experience, because when people are engaging with the material in different ways, maybe in a way that is less appreciative, or maybe people who feel challenged by it or want to challenge what we're saying, then, things happen in that exchange. So I think, part of the hope that I have is that people will engage appreciatively or otherwise with the ideas in the chapter, and also that people will potentially be moved to respond to it. Researchers who are actively engaged in research right now, or people who are considering that, or people whose everyday practice might not be as a researcher with a capital R, but people who are researching, evaluating, responding to their own practices, and this might offer a new lens for them. There's hopefulness within what is an unsettling and troubling picture, I guess. This is a kind of situation that we don't want to gloss over the seriousness. We don't want to be too hopeful, because if we're too hopeful, we might be complacent.
So I would love to pivot a little bit and circle back to both of you loving walking and being in nature, and to your as if examples of being trees. I think that's beautiful. So I'm going to invite each one of you to say one of the things that imagine that you are taking a long walk in nature and you're in the natural world. And if you were to ask the natural world, who wants to speak through me, what might each one of you come up with?
I think the first thing that occurs to me is that there isn't such a thing as the natural world anymore. It's a false distinction. The trees are infected by plastic particles if they're beyond a certain age. And in a way, we need to stop seeing ourselves as separate from the natural world. We need to see ourselves one, as part of it, and also see the built environment, see cityscapes as part of the natural world, whether they're standing on where forests used to be or whether there are trees struggling to survive in them. Because we're using trees now to bring back oxygen and fresh air and to cleanse our environment in cities. There's something that's been written a lot about the post-human era, meaning we're not just humans anymore. We are our technology. We are nature. Nature is technology. Technology is human. There's a real mix-up going on. Everything's changed. We are our phones are us, and others may know where we are and what we're doing, even though we don't know where they are. And we find our way through nature using our phones. I use my phone to help me guide my way through the landscape. So I think we need to, in a sense, not, thingify nature, like put it in a preserve or a reserve or a national park, which is a protective strategy, as though then the implication is we don't have to protect what exists outside of that, ring-fenced.
Yeah. What comes to mind, the word that comes to mind is this entanglement, that we're all entangled. So thank you for that perspective. That's really been so eye-opening for me, and I see that. So looking at concrete buildings made of sand, right? And the paper towels we use are made, the trees have contributed. So for those things, I don't know what to call them now, what might, in their natural state or in their original state, what might they have said to us as humans? Let me reverse the question. Is that possible to answer?
Well, Leah and I can come up with some examples. So we use the example of the glacier as well somewhere. That if glaciers could speak, they might, at their simplest, say, I'm going, I'm melting, bye-bye. They might just say goodbye. They might say, I can't hold you anymore, penguins. They might, the reindeer lichen or moss up in the mountains of Norway and Sweden and Finland might be saying, we can't carry on feeding you, reindeer.
So I'm thinking, are we getting? I feel like we're kind of getting caught in a linguistic trap, and the world is talking to us. The message is there. Things are falling apart. Things are not going well. Things are messed up, and that might not be packaged in a sentence. It might not be packaged in that form of communication. In a human form of communication, but the messages are there. I think it's less about what is the world trying to say, as more as how are we going to listen.
Yeah, thank you. So I wonder, as we close out, and let me say that for those of you who are listening, I'll be sharing resources to much of the work, or some of the work, that both Leah and Gail have contributed to the world, links to Murmurations, links to some of their papers. And so that will be found on positivitystrategist.com/podcast. And if you scroll through, you'll find reference to this particular episode. I'm inviting you both. Is there something else that you would like to say by way of closing out this conversation today?
I think transmaterial welding is a practice of hope. In a very honest way, it's recognizing that the world is in a terrible state. We can't thingify things. We can't separate ourselves out from the world, but at the same time, we have to take on board that we have responsibilities and choices. And from a social constructionist point of view in particular, we have to think, who's involved in this conversation? Who am I overlooking? What am I overlooking? What previous historical knowledges could usefully be heard here? And what do I need to do to change my ways of listening and finding out and knowing? to help resolve some of the everyday difficulties or the long-term struggles of the planet and its inhabitants, its many transmaterial inhabitants.
I guess I'd like to say that I kind of experience Transmaterial Worlding as a message of hope and also a message of responsibility and accountability. But that responsibility and accountability is not necessarily an individual one, although each individual needs to make their own choices and decisions in relation to that, and every individual can make a difference. But there's something about a kind of collective accountability, collective responsibility that, I can't think of many examples of when we're not. I mean, there are some, but not an awful lot of when we're not better together. And I think the we is not just a human we.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you, in that very succinct way, we've focused today on environmental issues, right, and planet and climate change and so on. But there are so many other things that we could have unpacked and gone in the direction, whether we're talking about different societal, we're talking about gender issues, we're talking about different, the disappearing of different cultures. So it's so rich. And I think this is the most exciting thing. When I was reading the chapter in the book and poking around, trying to understand more, I got incredibly excited about it. So I'm just hoping that people who are listening to this will have that same experience and want to go digging more.
It's a good form of digging. The transmaterial worlding there are a lot of digging tools in this chapter for potential researchers, for actual researchers. In effect, it's an invitation to experiment with a social conscience.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Just focusing on the application and the practicing of it. I think that's so helpful. Students are often looking for tools. So I tend to steer away from tools, but that's another construct, right?
Roseanne Leppington wrote a brilliant paper in 1991. She says it's better within a social constructionist framework to talk about discursive practices. And discursive practices are a form of action and activism. So these tools, if you like, these kinds of questions that we're offering that come from the systemic stable of interventive questions, hypothetical questions, imagining questions, they are very engaging, they're very accessible, and they're really good for researchers, really good for social constructionist researchers to think, how can I ask questions that bring forth maybe multiple perspectives, different voices, and not just try to look for single truths, because that's one of the biggest problems for a lot of researchers who are interested in social constructionist research, is that they have to find the resilience to withstand some of the dominant discourses that suggest they should be looking for a single truth that they could pull out of a situation, whereas social construction really is happy to disrupt and problematize and say there are many, many different perspectives, many different stories to tell. And it's not just a practical set of tools, social construction, it's an ethical way of being, to be asking and listening in different kinds of ways.
Yeah. And that's really helpful. And I really like the idea of just staying in inquiry.
Yeah.
Keep asking those questions.
As a way of life.
Yeah, as a way of life.
Yeah. Way of living.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you, Gail. Thank you, Leah, for being guest today.
Thank you, Robin.
Yeah, thank you, Robin.
You've been listening to two Taos Associate authors who are at the leading edge innovating social constructionist practice with transmaterial worlding. Please visit positivitystrategist.com/podcast where you'll find out more, and be sure to listen to our next episode in this exciting season. My guest will be Dr. Janet Newberry, and she'll be talking to me from British Columbia in Canada, where she lives. And the subject we'll be talking about is her research and practice through the lens of social construction into community development.
As always, a huge thank you to all of you who are listening, and also to the Taos Institute, who is making this season possible.